The first thing I heard after the crash was my wife choosing another man. Lenora said, take Xavier to Trauma 1.
Call doctor.
Pell and prepare the operating room. Someone beside me said, Doctor.
Ashford, your husband has no radial pulse.
His pressure is falling. Lenora said, Xavier may have internal bleeding. The paramedic said, Mr.
Vale has an open chest injury.
He needs surgery now. Lenora's shoes stopped beside my stretcher. I could not turn my head, but I knew those shoes. I had bought them for her when Halcyon Medical Center promoted her to chief of surgery. The dark red heels had cost more than my first car. Lenora said, Dorian can wait 5 minutes.
The paramedic said, he may not have 5 minutes.
Lenora said, that is my order.
Her shoes moved away. The ceiling lights slid over me as an orderly pushed my stretcher out of the trauma bay and parked it against a wall. I tasted blood. Every breath felt like broken glass moving inside my chest. Across the hall, a whole team gathered around Xavier Mercer. Xavier was Lenora's former husband. He had a cut above one eyebrow and blood on his shirt, but he was awake. I heard him call her name. Xavier said, Lenny, don't leave me. Lenora said, I am right here. She had not called me by a tender name in years. The crash had happened less than 20 minutes earlier. Xavier's black SUV had crossed a red light and hit the passenger side of my car. I had seen his face behind the wheel 1 second before metal folded around me. The airbag had burst. Glass had covered my lap. Then Xavier had climbed out of his SUV, looked through my broken window, and said one strange sentence. Xavier said, you should have signed the extension.
I had not understood him then.
I understood even less as I lay dying in my wife's hospital. A young nurse ran to my side. Her badge read Mara Bell. Mara said, Mr. Vale, stay with me. Can you hear me? I moved one finger. Mara called out, I need a doctor here. An orderly said, Doctor, Ashford assigned everyone to Trauma 1. Mara said, then find another doctor. The orderly said, she locked the board. No one can take the case without her release. Mara looked toward the crowded room where Lenora stood over Xavier. Then she checked the tube at my side. Blood was pouring through it too quickly. Mara said, his chest tube is giving pure blood. This is a massive hemothorax. The orderly said, what do you want me to do? Mara said, call Dr. Soren Pike. Tell him I'm invoking the emergency chain. The orderly said, Dr. Pike was suspended this morning. Mara said, suspended surgeons are still surgeons. She leaned close to me.
Mara said, Mr.
Vale, I'm going to move you.
It will hurt?
She did not ask Lenora. She did not wait for permission. She grabbed the end of my stretcher, and the orderly finally helped her. They pushed me toward an old service elevator at the back of the emergency department. Lenora shouted behind us, Nurse Bell, where are you taking that patient? Mara said, to a room with a doctor. Lenora said, bring him back. Mara said, his pressure is unreadable.
Lenora said, I gave you an order.
Mara stopped for 1 second. Her hands stayed on the stretcher. Mara said, your order will kill him. Lenora said, security. The elevator doors closed before anyone reached us. The last thing I saw was my wife standing beside Xavier's bed with one hand on his shoulder. The next hours came to me in broken pieces. A narrow room. Bright lamps. A gray-haired man in blue scrubs. Mara cutting away my shirt.
Someone forcing air into my lungs.
The gray-haired surgeon said, the rib punctured an artery.
We open now.
Mara said, Dr. Pike, we have no active operating room record.
Doctor,
Pike said, then write it on the wall. He will not die over a form. Darkness took me. When I woke, dawn light was coming through dusty blinds. I was not in the main hospital. The room had old cabinets and a small window that faced the loading dock. A ventilator breathed beside me, but the tube was no longer in my throat. Every part of me hurt. Mara sat in a chair with her head against the wall. Her scrubs were stained with my blood. I whispered, how long? She woke at once. Mara said, about 6 hours since surgery. Do not try to sit up.
I said, Lenora?
Mara looked at me for a moment. Mara said, Doctor, Ashford thinks you died. I watched her face. Mara said, your monitor lost connection when we used the service elevator. Someone entered a death time into the emergency record 11 minutes later. They listed cardiac arrest from traumatic injury. I said, who entered it? Mara said, the login belongs to Dr. Ashford. My mouth was dry, but my voice stayed clear. I said, why am I here? Mara said, this is the old surgical observation wing. It was closed after the renovation. Dr. Pike knew the power and oxygen still worked. He repaired the artery.
You lost a lot of blood, but you're stable.
I said, Xavier.
Mara said, a shallow scalp cut, 2 bruised ribs, and no internal bleeding. My wife had left me to die for a man who needed 12 stitches. I did not shout. I did not ask Mara why Lenora had done it. There was no answer that would change the blood on her scrubs. I said, "Where is my phone?" Mara handed me a clear bag. The screen was cracked, but the phone still worked. I called one number from memory. Tessa Quinn answered on the second ring. "Tessa," said Dorian. I said, "Do not say my name again. Do not call Lenora. Bring Arden Shaw to Halcyon's East Loading Dock." Tessa said, "What happened?" I said, "I am legally dead, and I needed to stay that way for one more hour." Tessa went silent. Tessa had managed my private office for 9 years. She knew I never used dramatic words. Tessa said, "I will be there in 20 minutes. I ended the call and looked at Mara. I said, "I need every record connected to my arrival. The original triage data, the monitor logs, the hallway cameras, and the order history." Mara said, "Accessing some of that could cost me my job."
I said, "Saving me already cost you your job."
Mara gave a tired laugh. Mara said, "That is probably true." I said, "I can protect you if you tell the truth." Mara said, "I did not save you for protection."
I said, "I know."
That answer was the first honest thing I had heard inside Halcyon in a long time.
Doctor.
Pike entered with a paper cup of coffee. He was in his early 60s, with heavy eyes and steady hands.
Doctor.
Pike said, "You should be unconscious." I said, "I have work to do."
Doctor.
Pike said, "You have a repaired artery, a chest full of stitches, and less blood than good sense." I said, "Why were you suspended?" He placed the coffee on the counter. "Doctor," Pike said, "I refused to sign off on 3 surgeries performed by doctors who were not qualified."
Your wife called that insubordination?
I said, "Which doctors?"
Doctor.
Pike said, 2 were hired through a staffing company owned by Xavier Mercer. The sentence settled over the room. I unlocked my phone and opened a secure app Lenora had never seen. A balance sheet appeared, followed by Halcyon's debt map. Through Vale Meridian Health Fund, I controlled the hospital's mortgage, its equipment leases, and the reserve account required for its operating license. Lenora believed I was only a quiet investor who had inherited money. She had never asked what I did before we married. She had never cared that I spent my days reviewing distressed hospitals, patient safety reports, and hidden ownership structures. Halcyon did not simply owe me money. It existed because I allowed it to exist.
I called Tessa again.
I said, "Freeze every discretionary transfer from Halcyon's reserve account. Do not touch payroll or patient care." Tessa said, "Understood."
I said, "Notify our compliance unit?"
Full emergency protocol. Tessa said, "What is the trigger?" I looked at the blood still dried beneath my fingernails. I said, "Attempted patient abandonment, false death reporting, record tampering, and suspected licensing fraud." Tessa said, "Who is the subject?" I said, "My wife." Dr. Pike checked the monitor again and told everyone except Mara to give me 1 quiet minute. I watched the second hand move across the wall clock. Lenora had once told me that trauma medicine was built on the value of each minute. She had been right. She had simply decided that mine were worth less. I would not make the same choice with anyone else inside Halcyon. Arden Shaw arrived wearing a raincoat over gym clothes. He was my personal attorney, but he had spent the first half of his career prosecuting healthcare fraud. He did not waste time asking whether I was all right. He looked at the drain from my chest, read the numbers on the monitor, and opened his laptop.
Arden said, "Tell me only what you know."
I told him about the crash, Xavier's sentence, Lenora's order, and the false death entry. Mara gave him the clinical timeline. Dr. Pike described the emergency surgery and signed a statement while the details were fresh. Arden said, "We need independent custody of the data before they rewrite it." Mara said, "The system keeps an audit trail." Arden said, "Audit trails can be buried."
Can they be exported?
Mara said, "Not from this wing." Tessa entered carrying 2 locked cases. With her came Imani Cross, the head of clinical compliance at Vale Meridian. Imani had once run emergency inspections for the state health department. She wore a plain navy suit and had the calm face of someone who had seen executives lie under oath. Imani said, "The hospital's license renewal was approved on a provisional basis 3 months ago. Their final safety certification is due next week." I said, "Who signed the provisional application?" Imani said, "Lenora Ashford as chief medical officer and Graham Voss as board chair." Arden said, "If the application contains a major false statement, the state can cancel the provisional license without waiting for a normal hearing." I said, "Find the false statement." Imani said, "I think your wife found it for us." She turned her laptop toward me. The application certified that Halcyon had no unresolved serious patient safety events, no unreported deaths, and no financial ties between clinical decision-makers and outside staffing vendors. Every line had become a target. Mara left to collect the records she could legally access as the nurse of record. Imani contacted the hospital's outside data storage company. Our loan agreement gave Vale Meridian emergency inspection rights when patient safety or reserve compliance was at risk. At the same time, Lenora was telling the world I was dead. My phone filled with messages. Lenora had sent a brief text to my sister. Lenora wrote, "Dorian was in an accident.
We did everything we could."
She had not called my sister. She had not asked which funeral home my family wanted. She had not even used the word sorry. Then a message arrived from Halcyon's public relations office. The statement said Halcyon Medical Center mourns the tragic loss of Dorian Vale, beloved husband of Chief Medical Officer Dr.
Lenora Ashford.
Despite heroic efforts by our trauma team, his injuries could not be overcome.
Heroic efforts.
I showed the statement to Arden. Arden said, "They published that before notifying the medical examiner." Imani said, "They also skipped the mandatory external review for an emergency department death." I said, "Save it." Arden said, "Already done." Mara returned with a portable drive and a paper folder. Mara said the electronic chart has changed. She laid 2 printed pages beside each other. The first was the triage note she had printed before surgery. It showed my blood pressure falling, a chest wound and the highest emergency level. The second had been printed minutes ago. My emergency level had been lowered. The note about active chest bleeding had disappeared. Mara said, "The new version says you arrived without signs of life."
Doctor,
Pike said, "That is impossible." 3 people spoke to him. Mara said, "There is more. The order log shows that I requested a trauma surgeon. The request was canceled under Dr. Ashford's account." Arden said, "Can she claim someone used her login?" Mara said, "The cancellation came from the tablet she carried into Trauma 1. The device location is recorded." Imani connected the drive to a clean computer. The hallway video showed Lenora standing beside my stretcher. It showed the paramedic speaking to her. It showed Mara checking my chest tube. There was no sound, but the timing matched every clinical entry. Then the video showed something none of us expected. After the elevator doors closed, Xavier stepped out of Trauma 1. He walked without help to Lenora. He placed one hand on her waist and said something. Lenora looked toward the elevator, took his face in both hands and kissed him. Mara turned away from the screen. I said, "Play it again." Arden said, "Dorian, that part is not needed for the medical case." I said, "Play it again." Imani replayed it. I watched once, then told her to stop. I did not need a third viewing. I had spent 4 years making excuses for Lenora's late nights, closed doors, and sudden need to discuss Xavier's staffing business at dinner. The kiss did not break my heart. It removed the last excuse.
I said, "Add it to the evidence file."
It shows Xavier was mobile and alert. Arden looked at me for a second and nodded. Tessa's phone rang. She listened, then covered the microphone. Tessa said, "Halcyon is trying to move $12 million from the reserve account to Mercer Clinical Partners."
I said, "For what?"
Tessa said, "Emergency staffing fees." Imani said, "That transfer would drop the reserve below the minimum required by the provisional license."
I said, "Block it."
Tessa said, "The board chair is demanding your authorization code." I said, "Send him the section of the loan agreement that says the code belongs to me." Tessa handled the call. A minute later, my own phone rang. Graham Voss' name appeared. I answered. Graham said, "Dorian, thank God."
"We received a strange freeze notice from your office."
I said nothing. Graham said, "Dorian." I said, "You heard I was dead." Graham's breathing changed. Graham said, "There must have been a misunderstanding." I said, "Who requested the transfer to Mercer Clinical Partners?" Graham said, "That is routine business." I said, $12 million is not routine. Graham said, "Lenora said the money was needed to stabilize operations after your accident." I said, "My accident happened 7 hours ago."
The invoice is dated last month.
Graham said, "You need to rest."
We can discuss this when you're stronger.
I said, "We're discussing it now."
Graham said, "You are emotionally involved." I said, "I am the secured creditor whose death you tried to use to empty the license reserve." He stopped pretending.
Graham said, "Be careful, Dorian."
"Halcyon is your wife's life." I said, "It was almost my death." I ended the call. Imani said, "He will warn them."
I said, "Good."
People destroy more evidence when they panic. Arden said, "Only if we are already watching." I looked at Imani.
I said, "Are we?"
Imani said, "We are now." Our data contractor began mirroring Halcyon's servers under the emergency audit clause. Every deletion created another copy, Every changed file kept its older version.
We watched the evidence grow in real time.
Lenora deleted 3 emails between herself and Xavier.
Graham changed the description of the $12 million transfer. Xavier's company uploaded 6 backdated invoices.
Imani said, they are doing our work for us.
Arden said, we still need a regulator willing to act today. I said, call State Commissioner Noel Hart.
Arden said, she will ask whether you are using a public process to punish your wife.
I said, then give her the file without my name on the first page. Imani assembled a short report containing only patient safety facts. A living patient declared dead, a critical triage change, a canceled surgical call, an unreported operating room, a suspected related party transfer, and the likely falsification of a provisional license application. Commissioner Hart joined a secure video call 12 minutes later.
Commissioner Hart said, Miss
Vale, are you asking me to close a hospital because your wife betrayed you?
I said no.
I'm asking you to inspect a hospital because its chief medical officer chose a favored patient over a dying one, falsified the record, and tried to move the license reserved to that favored patient's company. Commissioner Hart said, and the dying patient was you.
I said, the next patient may be someone without my evidence.
She read in silence. Commissioner Hart said, if these records are authentic, I can send an emergency team. I cannot promise the result. I said, I am not asking for a promise. Commissioner Hart said, what are you asking for?
I said, arrive before they learn the dead man is alive.
She ended the call. The clock kept moving. Commissioner Hart said, my inspectors will be there in 40 minutes. Preserve the original devices. Do not direct hospital staff outside your contract rights. I said, understood. After the call, Arden made me repeat the promise. He knew power used in anger could ruin a clean case. I authorized evidence preservation, safe funding, and nothing more. Lenora had treated rules as obstacles. I would use them as guardrails, even while they carried me straight toward her.
By mid-morning, Lenora had arranged a memorial meeting in Halcyon's boardroom.
She had not arranged a funeral because there was no body. According to the false chart, my remains had been transferred to the county medical examiner. The county had no record of receiving me, but Lenora told my sister there was an administrative delay. My sister, Celeste Vale, did not believe her.
Celeste called Tessa, and Tessa brought the phone to me.
Celeste said, if you are alive, say something rude. I said, your last gallery show needed better lighting. Celeste began to cry. Celeste said, I hate you. I said, I know. Celeste said, Lenora told me your face was too damaged for me to see you.
I looked at Arden.
I said, did she?
Celeste said, she said the hospital would handle everything. She asked me to sign a release. Arden held out his hand for the phone. Arden said, Celeste, do not sign anything. Forward every message to me. Tell Lenora you're driving in from the coast and will arrive this afternoon. Celeste said, why should I warn her?
Arden said, because we want her to keep talking.
The memorial meeting began at 11. We watched through the boardroom camera, which was part of the hospital's security archive. Lenora sat at the head of the table in a black dress. Xavier sat to her right with a white bandage above his eyebrow.
Graham Voss sat to her left.
Lenora said Dorian would want Halcyon protected from uncertainty. Graham said, his fund may challenge our access to the reserve. Lenora said, as his surviving spouse, I control his personal shares. Xavier said, then authorize the transfer before his office can interfere. Graham said, Vale Meridian owns the debt, not Dorian personally. Lenora said, Tessa Quinn will cooperate once she understands that I inherit his voting rights. I watched my wife plan to inherit me before my blood had dried. Xavier slid a folder toward her. Xavier said, sign the continuity declaration. It confirms that Dorian was not involved in daily hospital operations. Lenora said he was not. That was true only because I had chosen to stay out of her career. When Halcyon needed rescue financing, I had kept my name behind Vale Meridian so her colleagues would never call her success a gift from her husband. I had protected her pride so carefully that she had mistaken my silence for weakness.
Lenora signed.
Imani said, that declaration is false. He approved every reserve release and chaired the quarterly risk review. Arden said, save the clip. Xavier placed another document in front of Lenora. Xavier said, this one confirms the reserve transfer was approved before the crash.
Lenora read it.
Lenora said, the date is wrong. Xavier said, the date is useful. Lenora said Dorian never approved this. Xavier said, Dorian is dead. For the first time, Lenora looked uncomfortable.
Lenora said, I will not forge his signature.
Xavier said, you already changed his chart. No one in our room moved. Graham said, we should not discuss chart details here. Xavier said, then stop acting frightened.
We had one clean chance.
Dorian refused the loan extension, and now the extension is no longer a problem. The room went silent. I remembered Xavier standing beside my crushed car.
You should have signed the extension.
Arden said, that is motive.
I said, it is not proof that he caused the crash. Tessa said, we may have that too. She opened a report from the traffic data company used by our insurance group. Xavier's SUV had an active fleet tracker because Mercer Clinical Partners claimed it as a business vehicle. The tracker recorded speed, braking, and route history. Xavier had accelerated before entering the intersection. He had not touched the brake until after impact. Imani said he hit you on purpose. I said, send it to the police. Arden said, if we alert the police now, Lenora may stop talking. I said, a criminal threat comes before our strategy. Arden nodded and sent the file to Detective Rowan Cade, the officer assigned to the crash. On the boardroom screen, Lenora pushed the forged approval away. Lenora said, I saved your company for 2 years. Do not turn me into a criminal. Xavier laughed. Xavier said, you left your husband without surgery and marked him dead.
You crossed that line without me?
Lenora said, I thought he was going to die anyway. The words were quiet, but the microphone caught them.
Xavier said, then sign.
Lenora picked up the pen. Before she touched the paper, the boardroom door opened. 3 state inspectors entered with Commissioner Hart. 2 uniformed officers from the health department followed them.
Commissioner Hart said, no one leaves this room.
Halcyon Medical Center is under an emergency licensing inspection.
Graham stood.
Graham said, you cannot interrupt hospital operations without notice. Commissioner Hart said, the state can act without notice when there is evidence of immediate danger to patients. Lenora said, what evidence? Commissioner Hart placed a sealed order on the table. Commissioner Hart said, a patient was declared dead while still alive. Lenora's face emptied. Xavier said, that is impossible. Commissioner Hart said, then you should have no trouble explaining it. The inspectors collected phones and secured the records office.
One team went to the emergency department.
Another entered finance. Imani sent them the access key to the mirrored audit log. Then Detective Cade walked into the old observation wing. He was broad-shouldered, quiet, and angry in the controlled way of a man who disliked being used. Detective Cade said, Mr.
Vale, I am glad you are inconveniently alive.
I said, so am I. Detective Cade said, Mercer told my officers you ran the red light.
Dr.
Ashford confirmed his statement. I said, she was not at the scene. Detective Cade said, she said you called her and admitted you were distracted. Arden said, his phone records will disprove that. Detective Cade said, the traffic camera was offline. Tessa said, the fleet tracker was not. He read the report. Detective Cade said, I need the original data from the provider. Tessa said, it is on the way.
Detective Cade looked at me.
Detective Cade said, do you think your wife knew he planned the crash? I said, I do not know. Detective Cade said, do you think she wanted you dead? I looked through the small window at Halcyon's bright new tower. Lenora had once stood beside me at its opening and said the hospital would become her legacy. I said, she wanted Xavier safe more than she wanted me alive.
Start there.
The detective left to question them separately. Mara adjusted my medication. Mara said, you need to rest. I said, I will rest when the patients are safe. Mara said, that sounds noble, but your heart rate says it is stupid.
I said, are you always this direct?
Mara said, only with men who come back from the dead and immediately open spreadsheets.
For the first time since the crash, I smiled. Mara saw it and looked away, but the corner of her mouth lifted. The moment was small. It did not erase what Lenora had done. It reminded me that care could be simple. No speeches.
No promises.
Just one person refusing to leave another against a wall. At noon, Commissioner Hart called.
Commissioner Hart said, Mr.
Vale, we found your altered chart.
I said, I know. Commissioner Hart said, we also found 9 other altered charts. I sat straighter despite the pain.
Commissioner Hart said, your case is not the beginning of this problem.
I said, then find the beginning. The inspection team found the other cases because my false death entry carried the same digital mark as older edits. The changes had been made through an administrator tool that hid the visible name but could not remove the server's device code.
8 edits came from Lenora's tablet.
1 came from Graham's office. Imani said, this was a method, not a mistake.
Arden said, we should expect them to claim the tool was shared.
Mara said, it was not. Lenora made every department head use a personal device after a resident changed the wrong chart last year. I said, she created the rule that proves the edits were hers. Mara nodded. The irony did not make the records less terrible.
One chart involved a child.
Another involved an older patient who had returned 3 times before anyone admitted him. The names stopped looking like a list and became a line of people Halcyon had pushed against a wall.
I said, no family learns about this from the news.
Tessa said, we will contact them privately. I said, offer independent lawyers, not hospital lawyers. Pay the first consultation cost without asking them to waive anything.
Arden said, that will be expensive.
I said, so was hiding the truth. Arden agreed. He sealed the folder and wrote the time across the edge so no one could question when we had received it. The beginning was a woman named Elise Navarro. Elise had entered Halcyon's emergency department 8 months earlier with severe stomach pain. Her chart first showed signs of internal bleeding. A later version called the pain minor and sent her home. She died in her apartment that night. Her husband, Mateo Navarro, had complained to the hospital. Halcyon told him the original note did not exist. Graham offered him a small settlement if he signed a statement saying Elise had refused care. Mateo had refused. Imani found his name in a folder marked difficult families.
There were 8 other names beside his.
I said, call every one of them. Arden said, we cannot promise that their cases will reopen. I said, promise only that someone will listen. While our team made calls, Halcyon's board held an emergency session. The state inspectors had allowed essential patient care to continue, but all elective surgery was paused. The board wanted a way to remove Lenora without admitting the hospital had failed. Graham called Tessa and demanded that I attend. I attended by video. The screen in the boardroom came alive while Lenora, Xavier, Graham, and 7 directors sat around the table. Lenora had changed from her black dress into a white coat. She looked ready for a press conference. Graham said, this is a privileged board meeting.
I said, then remove Xavier.
He is a vendor, not a director. Xavier said, I represent Mercer Clinical Partners. I said, that is why you should leave. Graham said, Dorian, this hostility is not useful. I said, neither is declaring the controlling creditor dead. Lenora stared at the screen. Lenora said, where are you? I said, alive. Lenora said, I can see that. I said, you did not check before you signed my death record. Lenora said, the emergency department told me you had arrested. Mara was standing just outside camera range. I looked at her, and she brought the original triage sheet into view. I said, the emergency department told you I was critical and needed surgery.
You canceled the request.
Lenora said, that is not what happened.
I said, the audit log says it is.
Lenora said, you are confused? You had major blood loss. I said, you kissed Xavier in the hallway while I was being taken to emergency surgery. The directors turned toward her. Xavier said, that has nothing to do with patient care. I said, it proves you were walking, talking, and stable while my wife assigned the whole trauma team to you. Lenora said, Dorian, please.
We should speak privately.
I said, you made my death public. My answer will be public too.
Graham leaned toward the camera.
Graham said, what do you want? I said, immediate removal of Lenora Ashford as chief medical officer, suspension of every contract with Mercer Clinical Partners, full access for the state, protection for every employee who reports misconduct. Graham said, you do not control this board. I said, no, I control the debt, the equipment leases, the reserve account, and the building mortgage. One director said, Vale Meridian owns those. I said, I own Vale Meridian. No one spoke. Lenora had known I founded an investment office. She believed it managed family money and a few commercial buildings. I had kept my healthcare work separate because she once accused me of trying to stand inside her spotlight. I stepped back. I financed Halcyon through layers she never bothered to study. I told myself I was respecting her independence.
Graham said that ownership was never disclosed.
I said, it is disclosed on every signed loan document. You did not read past the company name. Xavier said, this is a bluff. Tessa placed 4 notices on the table beside my bed. I said at this moment, the $12 million transfer remains blocked. New capital spending is frozen. The equipment lease is in default because Halcyon made a false death report involving the lender's principal. I have also canceled the automatic extension of your credit line.
Graham said, you will destroy the hospital.
I said, I will keep patient care funded.
I will not fund theft.
Lenora said, you hid all this from me.
I said, I told you what I did.
You called finance boring and changed the subject to Xavier. Her face tightened. Lenora said, so this is revenge. I said, revenge would be leaving you on a hallway stretcher. This is an audit. Mara looked at me.
Dr. Pike tried and failed to hide a smile.
The first board director raised his hand. The director said, I move to place Dr. Ashford on administrative leave. Another director said, second. Graham said, we have not reviewed the evidence. The director said, the state is searching our records. Our lender has frozen the reserve, and a man we declared dead is speaking to us. I have reviewed enough for an emergency vote. The vote passed. Lenora removed her white coat slowly.
Lenora said, Dorian, after everything I did for you, you are humiliating me in front of my staff.
I said, you did nothing for me when it mattered. She left the boardroom. Xavier followed her. Detective Cade was waiting outside. Detective Cade said, Mr. Mercer, I need to speak with you about the crash. Xavier said, I already gave a statement. Detective Cade said, now I have your vehicle data. Xavier stopped walking. The video feed ended, but the work continued. Imani found a chain of payments from Halcyon to Mercer Clinical Partners. Mercer had billed for specialists who did not exist, overnight coverage by doctors who were not in the building, and procedures performed by people without proper credentials.
Dr. Pike recognized 3 names.
Dr. Pike said, I reported these surgeons. Imani said, your reports were closed under Lenora's login.
Dr.
Pike said, she told me the credentialing committee cleared them. Imani said, the committee never met. Mara said, how many patients were hurt? Imani said, we do not know yet. I said, then we treat every chart as evidence and every current patient as a risk. I called the chief executive of Northbridge University Hospital, Halcyon's closest competitor. He owed me no favor, but Vale Meridian had financed his new burn unit. I said, Elias, I need beds.
Elias said, how many?
I said, as many as you can safely open. Halcyon may lose its license today. Elias said, that will flood the city.
I said, I will pay the emergency staffing cost. Elias said, is this about Lenora?
I said, it is about patients. Elias said, give me 30 minutes. Within an hour, 3 hospitals agreed to accept transfers. Ambulances lined up under state supervision. Critical patients remained with trusted staff. Stable patients moved first. No one was abandoned because of my fight with Lenora. That mattered to me more than seeing her removed. Mateo Navarro arrived at the loading dock just after 1. He carried a worn envelope and a photograph of his wife.
Mateo said, Mr.
Vale, your office said you would listen.
I said, I will. He sat beside my bed and told me how Elise had called him from the hospital. She had said a kind nurse wanted to keep her, but a contract doctor had ordered discharge.
Mateo still had the voice message.
Elise's voice filled the room.
Elise said, they say it is only stress. I do not think they are right. The message ended. Mateo opened the envelope. Inside was a printed copy of Elise's first test result. It showed a dangerously low blood count. A lab employee had slipped it to him after the funeral. Imani compared it with the chart. Halcyon's current record showed a normal result.
Arden said, this is direct evidence of a changed lab value.
Mateo said, will someone finally say they killed her? I did not offer him a victory I had not earned. I said, someone will finally answer the question under oath. Mateo nodded. Mara stood near the window with her arms folded. Mara said, the nurse in Elise's message was me.
Mateo looked at her.
Mara said, I filed a safety report. It disappeared.
I should have called you.
Mateo said, you tried to keep her.
Mara said, I did not try hard enough.
Mateo said, you tried harder than anyone else.
He held out his hand. Mara took it. I watched them and understood that Halcyon's worst crime was larger than a corrupt wife or a greedy former husband. It had taught good people that speaking was useless. It had turned silence into policy. I said, that ends today. Mateo left the original lab report in Arden's evidence case, but he kept Elise's photograph. Before he walked out, he turned back toward me. Mateo said, do not put your name on the next building.
I said, I was not planning to.
Mateo said, good, put the patient's name somewhere instead. His request stayed with me. Halcyon had covered its walls with donor names and executive portraits. The people who suffered inside it had been reduced to numbers. If the building survived, that order would change. Lenora's first attack came less than 30 minutes after the board suspended her. She filed an emergency statement claiming my decisions were caused by pain medication, blood loss, and a mental break after the crash. She asked the court to appoint her temporary guardian and give her control of my personal voting rights. Arden read the filing beside my bed. Arden said, she says you have paranoid beliefs about a financial conspiracy.
I said the conspiracy sent invoices.
Arden said, she also says Nurse Bell abducted you and Dr.
Pike operated without consent.
Mara said, he was dying. Dr. Pike said, emergency consent applies. Arden said, I know. She wants a headline, not a judgment. The headline appeared 5 minutes later. Local sites reported that a grieving surgeon was trying to protect her injured husband from his own advisors. Lenora's attorney described her as a devoted doctor facing a family crisis. Then Lenora gave an interview on the steps outside Halcyon. Lenora said, my husband survived a terrible accident, and I thank God for that. He is confused and surrounded by people who are using his condition to seize a hospital. A reporter said, "Did you declare him dead?" Lenora said, "A charting error happened during a chaotic emergency." A reporter said, "Why was your former husband treated first?" Lenora said, "Clinical teams make triage decisions based on the information available." A reporter said, "Did you alter the chart?" Lenora said, "No." She lied with the same calm voice she used to tell patients they were safe. Arden said, "We can issue a statement." I said, "No." Tessa said, "Silence lets her story grow." I said, "Let it grow until the evidence cuts it down." The court scheduled a remote emergency hearing for later that afternoon. Lenora expected me to appear weak, drugged, and angry. I gave her exactly one of those things. I was weak. Mara reduced my medication only as far as Dr. Pike allowed.
Mara said pain is not a strategy.
I said, neither is slurred speech.
Mara said, "You are not skipping the medication." I said, "I was going to ask." Mara said, and I answered. The hearing began. Judge Alina Park appeared on screen. Lenora sat in a law office beside her attorney. I sat upright in bed with Arden, Mara, and an independent doctor.
Judge Park said, "Dr.
Ashford, you are asking for broad authority over your husband based on a medical opinion you signed yourself."
Lenora said, "I know him better than any doctor." Judge Park said, "That makes you his spouse, not an independent examiner."
Lenora's attorney said, "We have a psychiatric evaluation."
Arden said, "The evaluator never met Miss
Vale."
The attorney said, "He reviewed Dr.
Ashford's observations."
Arden said, "He signed the evaluation 2 hours before the accident." Judge Park looked down at the document. Judge Park said, "Explain that date." Lenora said, "It must be a clerical error."
Arden shared the document's metadata.
The file had been created 3 days earlier and edited that morning. It described me as obsessed with hidden threats, unable to manage money, and likely to retaliate against Lenora's colleagues. Judge Park said, "Mr. Vale, did you know your wife was seeking an evaluation before the crash?" I said, "No, Your Honor."
Judge Park said, "Can you tell me why you froze hospital funds?"
I said I froze one related party transfer. Payroll, medicine, and patient care remained funded. The transfer would have broken the reserve condition of Halcyon's provisional license. Judge Park said, "Who owns the receiving company?" I said, "My wife's former husband."
Judge Park said, "What evidence supports your concern?"
Arden submitted the invoices, server logs, and reserve documents. Lenora's attorney said, "These records were stolen." Arden said, "They were collected under the lender's signed emergency audit right." Judge Park said, "Dr. Ashford, why did you prepare a mental capacity document before your husband's accident?" Lenora said Dorian had become controlling. I said, "I refused to extend a loan to Xavier's company." Lenora said, "You were jealous of him." I said his company billed for doctors who did not exist. Lenora said, "You always hated that I trusted him." Judge Park said, "Dr. Ashford, stop. This is not marriage counseling." The judge denied her request. Then she went further. Judge Park said, "The backdated evaluation raises serious concerns. I'm ordering that no party use it for financial, medical, or public purposes pending investigation." Arden said, "Thank you, Your Honor." Lenora said, "Dorian needs me." I said, "I needed you in the trauma bay." She looked at the camera, and for one moment her public mask slipped. Lenora said, "You were supposed to die." Her attorney grabbed her arm. The room froze. Lenora blinked. Lenora said, "I mean, your injuries were expected to be fatal." Judge Park said, "The court reporter will preserve both statements." The hearing ended. Arden sat back. Arden said, "I have seen people lose cases in one sentence. That was a very expensive sentence." Mara restored my medication. The pain eased.
I said, "Send the recording to Detective Cade."
Tessa said, "Already sent." Lenora's second attack came through my home. Security cameras showed her entering our penthouse with Xavier. They went into my office and tried to open the wall safe. Lenora knew the code I had used years earlier. She did not know I had changed it after Mercer Clinical Partners failed its first audit. Xavier struck the keypad. Xavier said, "Where else would he keep the ownership papers?" Lenora said, "His private office." Xavier said, "Tessa controls that building." Lenora said, "Then we use the marital property claim." Xavier said, "We need the trust amendment before the police connect the crash to me." Lenora turned toward him. Lenora said, "You said the light changed."
Xavier said, "It did."
Lenora said, "The police have vehicle data." Xavier said, "Data can be wrong." Lenora said, "Did you hit him on purpose?" Xavier said, "I solved a problem." She stepped away. Lenora said, You told me he would sign after a scare. Xavier said he would never sign. You knew that. Lenora said I did not agree to kill him. Xavier said no. You only agreed to let him die after I failed. Our home system recorded every word. Arden said that separates her from planning the crash, but it confirms what happened in the hospital. I said, give it to Cade. Detective Cade did not wait. Officers entered the penthouse while Xavier was still trying to force the safe. Detective Cade said, Xavier Mercer, put your hands where I can see them. Xavier ran toward the balcony. There was nowhere to go. We lived 40 floors above the street. Lenora stayed beside my desk.
Lenora said, Detective, this is my home.
Detective Cade said, it is a crime scene now. Xavier was arrested for attempted murder, financial fraud, and evidence tampering. Lenora was not arrested that minute. She was taken for questioning about the false report, the chart, and her statement that I was supposed to die. The image of her leaving our building in handcuffs would have satisfied people who wanted a dramatic ending.
It did not satisfy me.
9 altered charts remained. Families were still waiting. The state had not yet decided Halcyon's license. I looked at the time. 17 hours had passed since Lenora left me in the hallway. 7 remained. Before the license conference, Celeste arrived with a small overnight bag and enough anger for the whole family. She stood in the doorway, looked at the bandage across my chest, and then hugged me carefully. Celeste said, I want 5 minutes alone with Lenora. I said, no. Celeste said, 3. I said, still no. Celeste said, you are difficult even after almost dying. I said, Mara mentioned that. Mara said, several times. Celeste looked between us but did not comment. She opened her bag and placed the unsigned release Lenora had sent her on my bed. The paper would have authorized immediate cremation after the medical examiner's review. Arden read it twice. Arden said, this form also releases Halcyon from claims related to handling the remains. Celeste said, she told me it was standard. I said, nothing about a missing body is standard. Imani checked the document code. The form came from Graham's private legal folder, not the hospital's patient services system. If Celeste had signed, Graham would have used it to explain why no body could be produced, and to narrow our family's right to challenge the record. Celeste said, they were going to erase you on paper.
I said, they tried.
Celeste said, then do not leave any part of them standing. I said, we remove the people who did this.
We protect the staff who did not.
She looked toward Mara and Dr. Pike.
Celeste said, fine.
Leave the good people standing. Arden added the release to the regulator's file. What Lenora called grief had produced a false chart, a false public statement, a backdated mental evaluation, and now a false cremation release. Her attack was no longer emotional or careless. It was organized. Commissioner Hart scheduled the emergency license conference for 6 that evening. The proceeding was not a full trial. It would decide whether Halcyon's provisional operating license had been obtained through false statements and whether the hospital posed an immediate danger. If the answer to both was yes, the commissioner could revoke the provisional license and place the facility under an emergency administrator. Graham Voss hired 3 attorneys. Lenora joined from the police interview room with her own lawyer. Xavier did not appear. His criminal attorney advised him to stay silent. I appeared from my hospital bed. Commissioner Hart said, this conference concerns Halcyon Medical Center, not the private marriage of Dorian Vale and Lenora Ashford. Graham's attorney said, the complaint began with a marital conflict. Commissioner Hart said, the inspection found 9 altered patient files.
Which marriage explains those?
The attorney stopped talking. Imani presented the audit in plain language. Halcyon had certified that it reported every serious safety event. It had hidden at least 4. It had certified that all surgeons were properly approved. Mercer Clinical Partners had supplied 6 doctors with incomplete or false records. It had certified there were no hidden financial ties. Lenora had approved invoices to a company owned by the man with whom she was having a secret relationship. Lenora's attorney said, an affair is not a licensing violation. Imani said a secret financial conflict affecting triage, staffing, and payment is.
Mara testified next.
Mara said Mr. Vale arrived conscious with a chest wound and falling blood pressure. I requested a trauma surgeon. Dr. Ashford canceled the request and ordered the team to treat Mr. Mercer. Lenora's attorney said, did Dr. Ashford say she wanted her husband to die?
Mara said, she did not need to say it.
She knew what waiting would do. The attorney said, you disobeyed a direct order. Mara said, yes.
The attorney said, you moved a patient to a closed wing.
Mara said yes. The attorney said, you helped a suspended surgeon perform an unregistered operation. Mara said yes. The attorney said, so you admit breaking hospital rules. Mara said, I broke rules that were killing him. Commissioner Hart said the state emergency care law protected her decision.
Doctor!
Pike testified that Lenora suspended him after he reported unqualified surgeons. The server log proved his reports had been deleted. Mateo played Elisa's final message and showed the original lab result. Lenora watched without expression until Mateo held up his wife's photograph. Mateo said, "Your hospital called her anxious.
She was bleeding to death."
Lenora said, "I never treated your wife." Mateo said, "You erased the report from the nurse who tried to save her." Lenora said, "I cannot review every complaint." Mara said, "You reviewed mine."
You wrote that I needed discipline for questioning a contract doctor?
Imani displayed Lenora's note. Graham's attorney asked for a break. Commissioner Hart said, "Denied."
I testified last.
Lenora's attorney said, "Mr. Vale, you stand to gain control of Halcyon if its current board fails." I said, "My fund already controls the secured debt." The attorney said, "You hid that ownership from your wife." I said, "This proceeding concerns the hospital." The attorney said, "You want to punish Dr. Ashford?" I said, "I filed for inspection because she changed a death record, canceled emergency care, and tried to drain the license reserve." The attorney said, "You're asking the state to close a major hospital in one day." I said, "I arranged safe transfer capacity before asking for closure. Vale Meridian will fund emergency care during the transition." The attorney said, "How generous." I said, "No, necessary." He changed direction. The attorney said, "You were unconscious for much of the event."
I said, "The cameras were not."
The hallway video played. Lenora watched herself stand beside my stretcher. The original triage times appeared beside it.
Mara's request flashed on screen.
Lenora's cancellation followed. Then Xavier walked out of Trauma 1 and kissed her.
The attorney said, "Turn that off."
Commissioner Hart said, "It speaks to Mr. Mercer's condition and the conflict of interest." Continue. The boardroom recording played next. Xavier said on the recording, "You already changed his chart." Lenora said on the recording, "I thought he was going to die anyway."
Finally, the penthouse recording played.
Xavier said on the recording, "You only agreed to let him die after I failed." Lenora said, "That statement is false." Commissioner Hart said, "Your response was recorded too." Lenora said, "I was in shock. I said nothing. The evidence did not need my anger." At 7:40, Commissioner Hart ended testimony. Commissioner Hart said, "Halcyon obtained its provisional license through material false statements. Its leadership concealed severe safety events, permitted unqualified practice, altered clinical records, and placed patients at immediate risk."
The provisional operating license is revoked effective tonight.
Graham closed his eyes. Commissioner Hart continued. Commissioner Hart said, "Essential emergency services will continue only under state control until all patients are transferred. Vale Meridian's proposed funding may be accepted without granting it control over clinical decisions."
I said, "Agreed."
Commissioner Hart said, "All current directors are removed from operational authority pending review. Employee retaliation is prohibited. The matters involving Dr.
Ashford, Mr.
Mercer, and Mr. Voss are referred to the medical board, attorney general, and district attorney." The order was signed at 7:52. 23 hours and 47 minutes had passed since Lenora ordered the team to leave me waiting. Halcyon's license was gone. Lenora stared at me through the screen. Lenora said, "You destroyed my hospital." I said, "Your choices destroyed its license." Lenora said, "Everything I worked for is gone." I said, "Elise Navarro lost everything."
I almost did.
Lenora said, "I am your wife." I said, "Not for much longer." Arden placed the divorce petition in front of me. He had prepared it while the commissioner reviewed the evidence.
I signed my name.
Arden transmitted it to Lenora's attorney. Lenora's phone made a soft sound. She looked down at the filing. Lenora said, "Dorian, wait." I ended the call. Outside, ambulances moved under the hospital lights. State officers placed the revocation notice on Halcyon's main doors. Reporters gathered behind the barriers. Staff members stood in small groups, frightened about their jobs but no longer afraid to speak. Mara came into my room after helping with the final transfer. Mara said, "The last intensive care patient is safely at Northbridge."
I said, "Any complications?"
Mara said, "None." I said, "Then it is done."
Mara said, "The first part is done."
I looked at her. Mara said, "You still have to recover. The families still need answers.
The good staff still need jobs."
I said, "You are very demanding for someone who no longer works at a licensed hospital." Mara said, "I hear your fund is hiring." I said, "Not nurses who ignore orders." Mara said, "Then I would never pass the interview." I laughed, and the stitches pulled hard enough to punish me. Mara adjusted the pillow behind my back. Mara said, "Careful."
I said, "You were right.
Mara said, about what? I said, the first part is done. Mara nodded once.
So did I.
For the future, Commissioner Hart entered the old wing before she left for the night. She carried the signed order in a plain folder. Commissioner Hart said, you understand that revoking the license does not give your fund permission to reopen the hospital.
I said, I understand. Commissioner Hart said, a new operator will need new governance, new credentialing, and a full inspection.
I said, then we build it correctly.
Commissioner Hart said, many owners say that after a scandal.
Most want the old business back with a new name. I said, this cannot be the old business.
Mara said, start with independent patient advocates.
Dr. Pike said, and a medical staff that can report the chief without asking the chief. Imani said, publish safety data, not a polished summary, the real numbers. I listened while they built the first rough plan around my bed. None of them asked for a grand lobby or a famous surgeon. They asked for open reporting, verified credentials, safe staffing, and a place where a nurse's emergency call could not disappear. Commissioner Hart said, send me a proposal after the criminal evidence is secured. I will not promise approval. I said, you never do.
Commissioner Hart said, that is why people trust the answer.
After she left, I asked Tessa to create a separate rebuilding account. The money would not come from the patient care reserve or reduce any family's claim. Tessa said, what should I call the project? I thought of Mateo holding Elisa's photograph. I said, for now, call it Open Door. Mara said, that is better than Vale Medical. I said, that name was never suggested. Mara said, I was preventing a future mistake. The hospital outside had gone quiet, but our small room no longer felt hidden. It felt like the first office of something that did not exist yet. The medical board suspended Lenora's license the next morning. The suspension was temporary until a full hearing, but it removed her from every hospital, clinic, and private practice in the state. She could not prescribe medicine. She could not touch a patient. She could not introduce herself as an active surgeon. For Lenora, losing the white coat was worse than losing our marriage. She called me from a lawyer's conference room. Lenora said, you made your point.
I said, the medical board made its decision.
Lenora said, do not hide behind procedure.
You gave them the evidence?
I said, you created the evidence.
Lenora said, I made one bad call under pressure.
I said, 9 altered charts are not one call. Lenora said, Graham handled the old complaints. Xavier handled staffing. I trusted the wrong people. I said, you canceled my surgeon yourself. Lenora said, I believed you could wait. I said, Mara told you I could not.
Lenora said, she was a nurse.
There it was.
Even after everything, Lenora still believed rank mattered more than truth.
I said, that nurse saved the life the chief surgeon threw away.
Lenora said, Dorian, I was afraid Xavier would die.
I said, he was talking. Lenora said, I had lost him once already.
I said, he divorced you because you would not finance his first company.
Lenora said, you do not understand our history.
I said, I understand enough.
You kept trying to rescue a man who used you and you punished everyone who showed you what he was.
Lenora said, I loved you. I said, you loved being safe with me.
You loved being needed by him.
She went quiet. Lenora said, if you continue the divorce, the press will tear us apart. I said, there is no us left to protect.
I ended the call.
2 days later, I transferred from the old Halcyon wing to Northbridge. Mara came with me as my private recovery nurse for the first week. Imani had offered her a permanent role on the patient safety team, but Mara wanted to finish caring for the man whose chart still called him dead. Mara said, it feels personal now. I said, that sounds unprofessional. Mara said, you can fire me when you walk without help. I said, then I may limp forever. She looked at me surprised, and I realized the sentence sounded like flirting.
Mara said, that was almost charming.
I said, the medication is strong. We kept the moment light. I had signed divorce papers less than 2 days earlier. Mara had spent a night fighting to keep me alive. Neither of us needed a fast romance built on shock. What grew between us began with trust, not promises.
The criminal case moved faster.
Xavier's fleet data provider confirmed every record. His SUV accelerated into the intersection. A search of his phone found messages to a mechanic asking how to disable the traffic camera near Halcyon. The camera had lost power 10 minutes before the crash. Detective Cade visited my room. Detective Cade said, the mechanic says Mercer paid him in cash. I said, will he testify? Detective Cade said, he already did. Mercer also searched for your route through the city. Arden said, that supports planning. Detective Cade said, we found something else. He placed a printed message thread on the table.
Lenora and Xavier had discussed the loan extension for weeks.
Lenora wrote, Dorian will not move. Xavier wrote, then scare him. Lenora wrote, Do not do anything stupid, Xavier wrote. You want Halcyon protected too. Lenora wrote, I want him to sign. Nothing more. The messages did not prove she planned the crash. They proved she knew Xavier was threatening me and never warned me. Detective Cade said, the district attorney may charge her with concealment and obstruction, but not attempted murder unless Mercer gives us more. I said, charge what you can prove. Detective Cade said, most victims ask me to charge everything. I said, weak charges give strong defendants room to escape.
Arden smiled.
Arden said, I taught him that. The families from Halcyon's hidden cases came forward one by one. Some had lost parents. One mother had nearly lost her child after a contract surgeon missed a simple infection. An older man had undergone the wrong procedure because two patients shared a last name and no one checked the birth date. Mara recognized 3 of the cases. Mara said, I thought I was failing. I said, the system was built to make you think that.
Mara said, I still stayed.
I said, you stayed because patients needed one person who cared. Mara said, that does not excuse it. I said, no, it explains why good people can remain inside bad systems. Now you help build a better one. Imani invited Mara to lead interviews with nurses and technicians. Staff members trusted her because she had risked her job in front of them. Within a week, more than 40 employees gave statements. Graham Voss resigned from every board he served on. He claimed he knew nothing about the false invoices. The server archive showed him changing payment descriptions and warning Xavier before inspections. The Attorney General froze his accounts. Then Xavier asked for a deal. His attorney offered evidence against Lenora and Graham in exchange for a lower sentence recommendation. Detective Cade called me before the meeting. Detective Cade said, you do not control the deal, but the prosecutor will consider your view. I said, if his evidence saves families years of uncertainty, hear it. Do not erase the crash. Xavier's evidence was a private recording he had kept as insurance. In the recording, Lenora and Graham discussed Elise Navarro's death. Graham said, if the first lab result survives, we lose the license. Lenora said, the vendor can correct the interface. Graham said, and the nurse. Lenora said, I will handle Maribel. Graham said, the husband will sue. Lenora said, then make him look unreasonable. The recording ended. Mara listened without moving. Mara said, she knew my name. I said yes. Mara said, she looked at me in the trauma bay like I was no one.
I said, she knew exactly who you were.
That is why she wanted you silent. Mara closed the laptop. Mara said, play it at the medical board hearing.
I said we will.
I kept that promise.
The board hearing took place in a public chamber 2 weeks later. Lenora arrived through a side entrance, but former Halcyon employees filled the back rows before she came in. Some wore scrubs. Others carried folders of reports they had once been told no one would read.
The board chair said, Dr.
Ashford, this hearing concerns your fitness to practice medicine. Lenora said, I have saved hundreds of lives. The board chair said, past skill does not excuse present harm. Her attorney called surgeons who praised her hands and her discipline. None had been in the trauma bay. None had reviewed the altered files. Then Mara testified. Lenora's attorney said, Nurse Bell, did you dislike Dr. Ashford before the accident? Mara said, I feared her. The attorney said, that was not my question. Mara said, I did not know her well enough to dislike her. I knew reports vanished after they reached her. The attorney said, you are now employed by her husband's fund. Mara said, I am employed by an independent review project. My salary does not change what her tablet did. The recording about Elise played. Lenora's own voice filled the room. Lenora said on the recording, I will handle Mara Bell. The board chair asked Lenora what handle meant. Lenora said, performance counseling. Mara placed her old evaluations on the evidence table.
Before Elise died, every review rated her highly.
After her complaint, Lenora wrote 3 warnings in 1 month and recommended termination. Mara said, she was not counseling me. She was building a reason to remove me.
Doctor.
Pike showed the same pattern.
So did a lab supervisor who had questioned change results. Lenora had not only hidden mistakes, she had built files against anyone who could reveal them. When the board announced the temporary suspension, nurses in the back row did not cheer. They simply stood together. Lenora looked at them as if she had never noticed how many there were. Outside, Mara released a breath. Mara said, I thought I would feel bigger. I said, you told the truth. It does not need to make you bigger. Mara said, it made her look smaller. I said, that was her own work.
Mara looked back at the chamber doors.
Mara said, then I'm ready for the next case. I said, there are too many. Mara said, Then we start with the first name and keep going.
That became the rule for the review team.
No hidden group of cases. No safe number that allowed us to forget the people inside it. One name, one chart, one family, and one answer at a time. Xavier and Lenora blamed each other before a judge ever saw them.
Xavier said Lenora had used his love to approve false contracts.
Lenora said Xavier had threatened her and used their old marriage to control her.
Graham said both of them had hidden the fraud from him.
The server logs made all three stories useless. At the criminal pretrial hearing, I sat in the front row with Celeste. I was walking with a cane.
Mara sat on my other side as a witness, not as my nurse.
Xavier entered in a dark suit. Without the expensive watch, fast car, and people who called him sir, he looked smaller. He tried to catch Lenora's eye. She stared straight ahead. The prosecutor began with the crash.
Detective Cade described the tracker, the disabled camera, and Xavier's route search.
The mechanic testified about the cash payment. An accident expert explained that Xavier had aimed toward the passenger side because he expected me to be driving alone. Xavier's attorney said the crash was meant to frighten me, not kill me. The prosecutor said he struck a moving car at highway speed. The attorney said Mr. Vale survived. The prosecutor said because a nurse disobeyed his wife's order. The judge denied Xavier's request to reduce bail.
Then the hearing turned to Lenora.
Her attorney said, Dr. Ashford did not cause the crash. The prosecutor said she caused the delay that nearly completed it. Her attorney said, medical decisions cannot be judged by outcomes alone. The prosecutor said, we are judging the altered record, the canceled request, the false death entry, and the attempted transfer. Lenora's attorney tried to present her as another victim of Xavier. Then Xavier's recording played. Lenora said on the recording, the vendor can correct the interface. Graham said on the recording, and the nurse, Lenora said on the recording, I will handle Mara Bell. The attorney asked for the recording to be excluded. The judge said, the objection is overruled for this hearing. Lenora finally looked at Xavier.
Lenora said, you recorded me?
The judge said, Dr. Ashford, speak through counsel. Xavier smiled at her. That smile ended whatever remained between them. During a break, Lenora passed close to him in the secure hallway. A deputy stood between them, but their voices carried.
Lenora said, you planned all of this.
Xavier said, you signed every page.
Lenora said, I protected you. Xavier said, you protected yourself. Lenora said, I chose you over my husband. Xavier said, that was your mistake. She struck him.
The deputy pulled them apart.
Cameras outside the hall caught enough for every evening broadcast. The great surgeon and the charming businessman were no longer standing together against me. They were tearing pieces from each other to save themselves. I did not celebrate. I watched. Celeste leaned close. Celeste said, you expected this. I said, people tied together by secrets always fight over who owns the rope. Celeste said, that sounded like something Arden wrote for you. I said, he wishes. The judge ordered Lenora to avoid contact with Xavier and released her under strict conditions. She had to surrender her passport and could not enter any medical facility except as a patient. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded us. A reporter said, Mr. Vale, do you want your wife sent to prison? I said, I want the court to follow the evidence. A reporter said, do you still love her? I said, this is a criminal case, not a love story. Mara glanced at me. A reporter said, will Vale Meridian take over Halcyon? I said, no private fund should control clinical care. We will finance a new nonprofit operator with an independent patient safety board. A reporter said, will you name it after yourself? I said no. Mateo stood behind the barrier with Elisa's photograph. I said, if the families agree, it will be called Navarro Community Medical Center. Mateo lowered his head. The reporters turned toward him. That announcement changed the story. Halcyon was no longer only a building closed by scandal. It could become a place built around the people it had failed. Lenora heard the announcement from the courthouse steps. She approached before her attorney could stop her. Lenora said, you are giving my hospital to a dead woman. I said, it was never your hospital. Lenora said, I built the surgical program. Mara said, and buried the reports. Lenora looked at her. Lenora said, you think saving one rich man makes you a hero? Mara said, no. Telling the truth for every patient you ignored is enough. Lenora turned back to me. Lenora said, is she why you will not speak to me? I said, your choices are why. Lenora said, you replaced me before the divorce is final. Mara stepped away, but I stopped the lie before it could grow. I said, Mara is not your replacement. She is the witness you failed to silence. Lenora said, You always needed someone to worship you. I said, Mara argues with me every day.
Mara said, twice before breakfast.
Celeste laughed. Even Detective Cade looked amused. Lenora stood alone in the middle of the steps, unable to control the scene. Her lawyer led her away. That evening, Mara and I walked through the empty first floor of Halcyon under state escort. The old signs were still on the walls. Chairs waited in the lobby. A child's red sweater lay in a lost property box. Mara said, buildings do not know what people did inside them. I said, people remember. Mara said, then give them something better to remember. We entered the emergency department. I stopped beside the wall where Lenora had left me. Mara said, do you want it removed? I said, the wall? Mara said, all of it. The hallway, the trauma rooms, the old wing. I said, no.
Rebuild it so no chief can lock every doctor onto one patient.
Put triage overrides under independent review. Give nurses a direct emergency line. Mara said, and the wall? I touched the paint with one hand. I said, put the patient rights desk here. We continued through the hospital with Imani and an architect. The old executive floor had private dining rooms and a lounge larger than the crowded family waiting area below. Mara said, turn this into family sleep rooms. The architect said, the plumbing would be expensive.
I said price it.
Imani opened the locked credentialing office. Cabinets held paper files the inspectors had not yet scanned. One drawer contained blank approval forms already signed by Lenora. Imani said, she pre-approved doctors before their files were complete. Mara said, take a photograph before touching anything. The state evidence team returned, sealed the drawer, and added another item to Lenora's case. In a lower-level supply room, we found unopened monitors while nurses upstairs had shared working machines. Halcyon had purchased the equipment to satisfy its inspection checklist, then kept it unused to avoid maintenance costs.
I said, install every usable unit.
Imani said, not until a new operator is approved. I said, then reserve them for reopening. The architect asked whether we wanted to keep the marble wall bearing Graham's name. I said, sell the marble.
Mara said, can you sell a wall?
I said, we financed Stranger Things. She laughed, and the empty floor gave the sound back to us. At the old surgical entrance, Dr. Pike joined us. He had refused an offer from Northbridge because he wanted to help rebuild.
Dr.
Pike said, I want peer review chosen by the medical staff, not the chief. Mara said, nurses need seats too.
Dr. Pike said, agreed.
Imani said, patients need seats. I said, then patients get seats. The architect filled a page with notes. The plan growing in that empty building was the opposite of Lenora's world. No single person could control the records, the reports, the money, and the careers of everyone who questioned her. Power would be divided on purpose. Before we left, I removed the brass sign from Lenora's former office. I did not keep it as a trophy. I handed it to the evidence clerk because the back held a small storage device. Xavier had hidden copies of invoices inside the sign frame. Mara said, even the nameplate was lying. I said, at least it finally became useful. As we left, a former housekeeper waited near the service elevator. Her name was June Reddick. She had cleaned executive offices at night for 11 years. June said, Mr. Vale, I have something you should see. She handed Imani a key to a records closet that did not appear on the floor plan. June said, Mr. Voss used to bring boxes there after legal meetings. The closet contained complaint letters, returned settlement checks, and internal notices marked for destruction. June had kept the key because Graham once ordered her to clear the room without a witness. She had refused. Imani said, why did you wait until now?
June said, because yesterday they could fire me and call me a thief.
Today somebody may listen.
I said, we are listening.
The files gave 3 more families proof that their complaints had reached the board. They also showed why a safe hospital needed more than brave doctors and nurses. People in every job saw pieces of the truth. They needed a protected way to bring those pieces together. Lenora delayed the divorce for 3 months. She challenged the trust, claimed part ownership of Vale Meridian, and accused me of hiding marital property. Her attorneys sent demands for years of records. Arden sent the records back in perfect order. Every important asset had been disclosed in our prenuptial agreement. Lenora had signed it after review by her own lawyer. Vale Meridian had existed before our marriage. Halcyon's debt belonged to the fund, not to me as a private person. Lenora's biggest claim was our penthouse. I offered to sell it and divide the value according to the agreement. She refused. She wanted the home because losing it would look like losing. At the property hearing, her attorney questioned me.
The attorney said, Mr.
Vale, did you conceal the full value of Vale Meridian from Dr.
Ashford? I said, no.
The attorney said, did she know you controlled Halcyon's secured debt? I said, She received the disclosure schedule before our wedding and signed annual conflict forms as chief medical officer. The attorney said, "Did you explain those forms?"
I said, "Her independent lawyer did."
The attorney said, "You allowed your wife to believe she had built Halcyon without your help." I said, "She built the surgical program."
My fund financed the hospital.
Both statements can be true. The attorney said, "You enjoyed holding secret power over her." I said, "If I wanted to hold power over her, I would not have stayed out of hospital operations for 4 years." The attorney said, "You moved against her within hours of the crash." I said, "Because patients were in danger within hours of the crash." He showed the hallway video. The attorney said, "Did this personal betrayal make you angry?" I said yes. The attorney seemed pleased. The attorney said, "So anger shaped your choices." I said, "That is why every licensing decision was made by an independent regulator, every criminal decision by a prosecutor, every financial freeze under a signed contract, and every patient transfer under a state plan." The pleasure left his face. Lenora took the stand. She said our marriage had become cold because I cared more about control than love. She said Xavier understood the pressure of medicine. She said she had turned to him for comfort, not money. Arden showed her the Mercer invoices. Arden said, "You approved payments to your former husband while having an affair with him." Lenora said, "The relationship became personal later." Arden showed the date of the hallway kiss, then messages from 6 months earlier. Lenora wrote in one message, "I wish I had never left you." Xavier wrote, "Then prove who comes first." Arden said, "When did it become personal?" Lenora said, "I do not remember." Arden said, "Did you tell your husband about the conflict?"
Lenora said no.
Arden said, "Did you disclose it to the hospital board?" Lenora said, "No." Arden said, "Did you approve the invoices?" Lenora said, "Yes." Arden said, "Then you do not have a hidden asset claim. You have a hidden conflict problem." Her attorney objected. The judge sustained the objection, but the point remained. The judge enforced the prenuptial agreement.
The penthouse was ordered sold.
Lenora received her personal savings, her clothing, and the share of our joint account that existed before the fraud investigation froze her recent transfers. She received no part of Vale Meridian and no claim over the new medical center. After the hearing, she waited for me in a conference room.
Lenora said, 5 minutes.
That is all I'm asking.
Arden said, "You do not owe her that." I said, "I know."
I entered.
The door stayed open, and Arden remained outside. Lenora looked different without the white coat and careful public makeup. She was still beautiful. Beauty had never been the problem.
Lenora said, "Xavier took the deal."
I said, "I heard." Lenora said, "He will testify against me."
I said, "You both kept evidence against each other."
Lenora said, "He says I approved everything."
I said, "Did you?"
Lenora said, "Not everything."
I waited.
Lenora said, "I changed Elise Navarro's review. I closed Pike's reports. I approved doctors I should not have approved." I said, "And my chart?" Lenora said, "I lowered the triage level." I said, "Why?" Lenora said, "Xavier was screaming my name. There was blood all over him. I thought if I chose you, I would lose him again." I said, "So you chose him?" Lenora said, "For a few minutes." I said, "Those minutes were my life." Lenora said, "I know that now." I said, "You knew it then."
Mara told you?
Lenora cried. I had seen her cry at funerals, movies, and award dinners. I had once crossed rooms to hold her before the first tear fell. This time I stayed where I was.
Lenora said, "I entered the death time because Graham said an investigation would close Halcyon."
I thought you were already gone. I said, "You did not check." Lenora said, "I was afraid to." I said, "No. You were afraid I might still need you." She covered her face. Lenora said, "I am sorry." I said, "Tell that to the families under oath." Lenora looked up. Lenora said, "If I plead guilty, will you speak for me at sentencing?"
I said, "I will tell the truth."
I will say you did not plan the crash.
I will also say you knowingly left me without care and hid other patients' harm.
Lenora said, "You could ask for mercy."
I said, "Mercy belongs to the people you hurt."
I cannot spend theirs. She nodded slowly. Lenora said, "Do you love Mara?" I said, "That is no longer your question." I left the room. The divorce became final 2 weeks later. Lenora pleaded guilty to obstruction, insurance fraud, falsifying medical records, and reckless endangerment. The judge sentenced her to prison, restitution, and a permanent ban from healthcare leadership. The medical board revoked her license. Graham also pleaded guilty after the server logs destroyed his defense. Xavier went to trial on attempted murder and fraud. The jury convicted him on every major count. When the verdict was read, he turned toward me. Xavier said, "You think you won?" The deputy told him to face forward. I said nothing.
I had survived.
The truth was public. The patients had a path to compensation. Winning did not need a speech. Sentencing came in stages. Xavier received the longest term because the crash had been planned. The judge described the hospital fraud as part of his motive, not a separate business mistake. Graham received less time after returning hidden funds, but the court barred him from directing any healthcare company. Lenora's sentencing drew the largest crowd. Mateo spoke first. Mateo said, "My wife called your hospital because she wanted to live. You changed the number that proved she was dying. I cannot ask for the years she lost, because no court has them." Mara spoke next. Mara said, "Dr. Ashford taught staff that telling the truth would cost us our careers. Some people stopped reporting. Patients paid for that fear. Then I stood with my cane. I said, Lenora did not plan the crash. That truth matters. She also knew I was alive, knew I needed surgery, and chose to remove my chance. That truth matters too. Please sentence her for what can be proved, not for who she once was to me." Lenora cried without looking at me. The judge said, "A medical license gives a doctor access to people at their weakest." Dr. Ashford used that access to protect herself and punish those who spoke. Her skill makes the betrayal greater, not smaller. After the sentence, Celeste asked whether I felt free. I said, "The divorce made me free. This gives the families an ending." Celeste said, "Is it enough?" I looked at Mateo talking with Mara near the courtroom door. I said, "An ending is not the same as repair." That afternoon, Vale Meridian transferred the first recovered fraud money into the Independent Patient Fund. No family had to wait for the new center to earn a profit.
Repair could begin before the building reopened.
The fund had one condition: no payment could buy silence. Families could speak publicly, report new evidence, or continue legal action where the law allowed it. Graham's old forms had treated money as an eraser. Our forms treated it as one small part of accountability. Arden said some insurers will hate this. I said, they can explain that at the public board meeting. The first meeting lasted 4 hours. Families challenged our numbers, deadlines, and outside reviewers. No one was removed for raising a voice. We answered what we could and published what we could not answer yet. Mateo said afterward, "That was messy." I said, "Truth usually is." Mateo said, "Good. The old meetings were always too clean." He joined the next meeting as a permanent community representative. His first motion required every future safety report to include unresolved complaints, not only closed cases. The board approved it without debate. Navarro Community Medical Center opened 1 year after Halcyon's license was revoked. The building looked different. We removed the dark glass from the entrance and opened the lobby to daylight. The emergency department had 2 independent triage leads on every shift. Any nurse could call an outside review team without asking a chief. Every change to a patient record created a notice that no administrator could erase.
The wall where Lenora left me held a simple desk with a blue sign.
Patient rights and family support. Mateo Navarro cut the opening ribbon. He brought Elise's photograph but refused to stand alone.
Mateo said Mara should be here.
Mara stood beside him in a navy suit. She was the center's first director of patient advocacy.
Dr.
Pike served as chief of surgery under an independent clinical board. Imani chaired the safety committee. Vale Meridian financed the rebuilding but had no vote on individual medical decisions. Reporters asked why I had given up direct control. I said, "Money should keep the doors open. It should not decide who deserves care." Celeste said, "That sounded like Arden wrote it." Arden said, "I offered him a better line." I said, "His line was too long." The staff laughed, and the doors opened. Our first official patient was an older woman who slipped on the front steps during the ceremony. Mara ran toward her before anyone could call for help. Mara said, "Can you tell me your name?" The woman said, "I came for free cake, not an ambulance." Mara said, "You can have both." Dr. Pike checked the woman's ankle and declared it bruised, not broken. The woman left with cake, an ice pack, and 3 nurses asking whether she had a ride. That small scene meant more to me than the cameras. The center spent its first months rebuilding trust. We opened all old Halcyon claims to independent review. Vale Meridian funded a compensation pool, while money recovered from Graham, Xavier, and the former board returned to it. Some families accepted settlements.
Others went to court.
No one had to sign a statement saying the harm was their fault. Mateo joined the community board. He asked hard questions at every meeting. Mateo said, "If a complaint is closed, who checks the person closing it?" Imani said, "The patient safety committee reviews it." Matteo said, and who checks the committee? Mara said, the public board reviews a monthly report. Matteo said, good.
I plan to read every page.
He did.
My recovery took longer than I wanted.
One lung remained weaker.
Cold weather made the repaired ribs ache. Mara stopped serving as my nurse after the first week, but she continued ordering me around.
Mara said, you missed physical therapy.
I said I had a board meeting. Mara said, your legs do not care. I said, my legs have poor respect for leadership. Mara said, your legs know you are stubborn. We had dinner for the first time 6 months after the crash. It was not planned as a date. A hospital meeting ended late. Rain covered the city, and the small restaurant across the street was still open.
Mara said, if this becomes awkward, I am ordering dessert and leaving you with the bill.
I said, that sounds fair. We talked about everything except Halcyon. Mara had grown up above her mother's bakery. She had become a nurse after a stranger helped her younger brother during a severe asthma attack. She liked old crime movies, hated expensive coffee, and kept a list of places she wanted to visit. I told her that Celeste and I had been raised by a father who treated emotion like bad accounting. I told her I started Vale Meridian after watching a rural hospital close because investors sold its equipment. I told her I had married Lenora because her drive looked like courage. Mara said maybe it was courage once. I said, maybe. Mara said, you do not have to turn every memory into a lie because the ending was bad. That was the kindest thing anyone had said about my marriage. I said, you make it difficult to hate people properly. Mara said, I hated Lenora very well for several months.
I said, past tense.
Mara said, hate is heavy. I have charts to review.
We ordered dessert together.
Our relationship moved slowly after that.
No secret kisses in hospital halls.
No promises made during crisis.
We went to concerts, argued over restaurant choices, and spent Sundays with Celeste. Mara kept her own apartment and her own career. I never offered to solve a problem she had not asked me to solve. On the anniversary of the crash, we walked through the emergency department after midnight. The lobby was quiet. A nurse at the patient rights desk was helping a father understand his daughter's care plan. Mara said, do you still hear it? I said, hear what? Mara said, Lenora choosing him. I knew what she meant. For months, the memory had returned whenever wheels moved over a hospital floor.
I said sometimes.
Mara said, and now I listened.
Monitors sounded behind closed doors.
A cleaner pushed a cart. Someone laughed softly at the nurse's station. I said, now I hear you, closing the elevator doors. Mara took my hand. Mara said, you did the rest.
I said, not alone.
We stopped at the wall. A framed card sat on the patient rights desk. It carried one sentence from Elise Navarro's final message, please listen when a patient says something is wrong.
No executive name appeared under it.
No donor's name covered the wall.
The words belonged to every person who entered. My phone rang. It was Tessa. Tessa said, sorry to call late. The state approved the center's full 5-year license. I looked at Mara.
I said, any conditions?
Tessa said, 1.
Commissioner Hart wants the first safety report on her desk next month.
Mara said, tell her it will be early.
Tessa laughed. Tessa said, I heard that.
Good night.
The call ended.
1 year earlier, Halcyon's leaders had believed a license was a shield.
They believed money could buy silence, titles could erase mistakes, and a dead man could not challenge a false record.
They were wrong about every part.
Xavier lost his company, his freedom, and the future he tried to steal.
Graham lost his fortune and every board seat that once gave him respect.
Lenora lost the medical career she had placed above human life. None of them fell because I ordered the city to reject them. They fell because their own messages, invoices, recordings, and choices met the light. I did not need to rule a hospital or make anyone fear my name.
I needed the doors to stay open for the right reasons.
Mara said, you're doing the silent, serious face again. I said I was thinking.
Mara said, that is usually how it starts.
I said, how what starts? Mara said, a long speech, a new policy, or a very expensive renovation. I said, I was thinking about breakfast. Mara said, at this hour? I said, the bakery near your old apartment opens early. Mara said, that is not near here. I said, I know. Mara smiled. Mara said, then we should leave now. We paused outside beneath the new sign. Morning had begun to soften the edge of the dark sky. An ambulance turned into the drive, and the doors opened before it stopped. Mara said, 1 year ago, you froze the money. I said, only the money they were stealing.
Mara said, I know.
That difference is why this place exists.
I said, 1 year ago, you ignored the chief surgeon.
Mara said, only the order that was killing you I said, that difference is why I exist. She rested her head briefly against my shoulder.
No camera watched us.
No crowd waited for a statement. The moment belonged only to us. Inside, the ambulance team rushed a new patient toward trauma care. 2 clinicians checked the triage decision and a nurse entered the reason into a record the patient rights team could review. The process took seconds. Safety did not have to mean delay. It meant no one person's fear, love, rank, or secret could decide whether another person received a chance. Mara said, ready for breakfast? I said, after I answer one email. Mara said, no. I put my phone away.
I said ready.
Mara held out her hand again. I took it without hesitation. The new center did not erase the scar across my chest or the names in the old files. It gave those scars a purpose. Every open door, protected report, and answered family proved that survival could become more than revenge.
We walked out through the bright lobby.
I did not look back at the old hallway. I did not need to. The night Lenora let me die had ended with a nurse refusing to obey her. The life I built after it began the same way, with the right person taking my hand and leading me somewhere better.